both sides are radicalizing even further. And we call that in the literature reciprocal dehumanization. And the only way the science shows that you can get out of reciprocal dehumanization processes is if you talk to the other side, but you recognize faults inside of yourself. Rather than challenging the belief, you have to acknowledge and concede 2 good points or 3 good points about the other side, and then reflect upon your own side's faults and show that you can live in a space of nuance. That creates the opportunity for dialogue. And as one person that works with me, Daryl Davis, says, when you're talking, you're not fighting.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. What happens when an ultimatum doesn't work? And instead of bringing people into alignment with your cause, it pushes them into the very thing you're trying to prevent or discourage. In the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States, President George W. Bush famously stated, "Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists," effectively launching the 20-year war on terror that, as evidenced by recent events in Afghanistan, has proven to be unfathomably costly, both in terms of dollars and lives, with no easily identifiable enemy and no clear-cut definition of success. For people like Jesse Morton, who at the time was a young man trying to find his way in the world after a childhood filled with pain and abuse, who had recently come to find Islam as a potential landing spot to find community, connection, and belonging, President Bush's words laid out a duality of choice. And Jesse took the path that President Bush and nearly all other Americans wanted to avoid. Over time, Jesse became one of the most prominent radicalizers in the West, co-founding Revolution Muslim, a New York City-based group that worked to spread the message of Al-Qaeda and the jihadist ideology. Over the years, Revolution Muslim was connected to a number of terrorism cases across the world. Why did Jesse opt for this path? Why did he make the choice he made? What could have encouraged him to go in a different direction? This is what he and I discuss, and much more this week here on the show. And just as a heads up, Jesse and I recorded this conversation before the United States' sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan, so we didn't even get the chance to talk directly about that situation, but many of the concepts and perspectives Jesse shares can easily relate to that situation. Now, Jesse has since put his radicalization days behind him, as he now works to stop the spread of violent extremism and the behaviors that lead to it. This is the first part of a 2-part series I'm doing on extremism, and it is a sobering look at the path that we find ourselves on here in the United States, from someone who, at one time, worked to bring about the very disarray, polarization, and mistrust that we are faced with today. And just as a point of clarification here, when Jesse mentions liberal world order, he's referring to the post-World War II coming together of nations that created international organizations and policies and agreements that promoted global cooperation on major issues like security and trade and health, so as to avoid the violence the world experienced in World War I and World War II. He's not talking about political liberalism. Jesse and I discuss the ramifications of reciprocal dehumanization, where opposing sides both see each other as less than. We talk about the immense difference between simply airing grievances and creating a vision that supersedes the allure of extremist ideals and behaviors. And ultimately, we dive into what the end game might look like if we don't seek ways to unearth common ground with each other. I want to read you something that I found that you wrote at the end of 2020, and I want to use that as kind of our jumping off point for our discussion here today. You wrote, "If there is one lesson we should have learned since President George Bush stated, 'You're either with us or you're with the terrorists' in the aftermath of 9/11, it is that it is not so much about who they, whoever they may be, are, but about who we are. Yet today, as we also approach 20 years into the war on terror, that overly simplistic mentality of good and evil, us versus them, predominates as well at home. The other side, the other guy is the problem, the terrorists, and cause of disarray. This mentality underlies all of prolonged intrastate conflict." So my question, Jesse, and all of that, as you, with your background, your experience, as you look out into the world today, preventatively, you go on to write that prevention is better than curing. Preventatively, where in the world do we begin?
Well, let me start with a little bit of a bleak outlook, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
In approximately another month, we will be approaching the 20th year of the war on terror. Osama bin Laden sent al-Qaeda operatives to attack the World Trade Center and the other targets, the Pentagon and the White House, unsuccessfully. But in the response to that and the statement that you read from George Bush, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists," we set up a sort of good and evil outlook that has now encapsulated the entire world. And as has been said, the chickens are coming home to roost. When we invaded Iraq, we were under the narrative that the terrorists of al-Qaeda attacked us because they didn't like our democracy, they didn't like our human rights, and they didn't like our freedom. Osama bin Laden issued a statement where he said that it wasn't because of our human rights, our freedom, or our democracy. It was because we were propping up authoritarian regimes, because we had killed 1.5 million children in Iraq with sanctions in the 1990s, because we had unconditional support for the state of Israel, a very simplistic black and white worldview as well, without any nuance. But he told us about his strategy. He said, "I fought the Soviets in Afghanistan for 10 years, and it took me 10 years to bankrupt them. And in 20 years, I estimate that I'll be able to bleed you to bankruptcy, because all I have to do is send 2 al-Qaeda operatives anywhere in the world to wave the black flag of al-Qaeda. And the United States will race there with its military and do things that will only benefit its multinational corporations." He could not at that time have predicted that at the same time, the things that we would use as interventions in the war on terror would discredit the claim that we in fact uphold democracy and human rights. And so at the end of the day, we are now looking at a 9/11 where we will at the same time be withdrawing from Afghanistan, 20 years almost in Afghanistan. And the original plan before they expedited the removal of American troops was to actually withdraw on September the 11th. And right now, for every jihadist that is around the world, they're looking at Afghanistan as the next haven of sanctuary, and they're looking at the fact that what Osama bin Laden said is probably correct. The real problem, in simplistic terms, is that when you split the world up into black and white, you can't understand the epistemological, the ontological, the philosophical nature of your enemy. And if you don't know your enemy, right, then you can't win any war. And if you live in the 21st century and you approach war from a solely military perspective, not that war is completely unjustified and unwarranted, and you don't look at it as a world of interconnectivity where ideas matter much more than bombs, then you have a serious complication, because in the course of fighting a war on terror, we have completely delegitimized ourselves in the eyes of many people around the world and what we uphold. And as a consequence of that, it's very hard to send messages that can actually get to that prevention that you're talking about, right? And the reason being is because if you're offering a counter narrative, then you're responsive, you're reactionary. And so what we call counter narratives in the realm of strategic communications, preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism work, doesn't work. because anytime you try to tell somebody who's committed to a belief that they are wrong and you confront the belief alone, then it only solidifies their belief and it only further exacerbates that us versus them divide. Instead, what you have to do effectively is you have to promote a counter vision. You have to promote something that provides the same meaning, significance, and purpose that extremists are able to offer their recruits, which is the exhilaration of the soul, speaking to the spiritual component of human beings. And we've taken that out of our messaging and we've delegitimized ourselves with our behavior. And now what we see is that the very same processes that created the black and white us versus them, evil and good, that were in the international arena have now come home. And so now we're labeling each other terrorists on both sides. The far right is labeling Antifa and the far left terrorists, and the left is labeling the far right and extremists as terrorists. But it's gotten so bad in the aftermath of the elections that it's actually being to the point where general liberals and general conservatives are conflated as terrorists collectively. And when you get that process throughout history, when we look at the world of peace building and conflict mitigation and conflict prevention at an international level, all of the indicators that precede civil war and interstate conflict are present now domestically. At the same time, in a competitive world of globalization where other systems, authoritarian systems in Russia and China and in Iran are rising, and solidifying a threat to the liberal world order and calling it a law-based order, we now see the potential for what to us resembles very much the interwar period between World War I and World War II, with the war on terror winding down, the economic consequence, the social consequence, the division between left and right is now getting to a degree where we could really likely see a rise of something that would resemble fascism, of something that would resemble an authoritarian solidification that resembled what Italy, Japan, and the Nazis did in the aftermath of having liberals rise to power in the aftermath of World War I, push inflationary policies, push cultural divide, and in a sense, push back against traditionalism, but fail in their policies. And so we're sitting in a very, very precarious situation where we're looking at midterm elections coming up. We're looking at the potential reelection of Donald Trump, who has already announced that he's going to run for president again. But both sides are radicalizing even further. And we call that in the literature reciprocal dehumanization. And the only way the science shows that you can get out of reciprocal dehumanization processes is if you talk to the other side, but you recognize faults inside of yourself. Rather than challenging the belief, you have to acknowledge and concede 2 good points or 3 good points about the other side, and then reflect upon your own side's faults and show that you can live in a space of nuance. That creates the opportunity for dialogue. And as one person that works with me, Daryl Davis, says, when you're talking, you're not fighting. And so you have to work to continue and sustain a dialogue. That dialogue no longer exists. And if we don't figure out a way to rejuvenate and regenerate and stop these processes of exacerbated polarization and hyperpolarization, then I really fear for our future as a democracy. And I fear for the sustainability of the liberal world order. As someone who used to be a propagandist for the extremist, I know that in the time that I spent, a decade of my life from 2003 till 2011, 2012, that this was all part and parcel of the plan that we envisioned with regard to the war of attrition. We were told to divide the populace first by creating sentiments for Islamophobia so that we could split the world into black and white, and then knowing that as a consequence, democracy could not function if both sides of a 2-party political system were divided, that there would be no way to sustain policy and that there would be no way to have a fruitful democracy that could produce consistency, sustainability, and stability. Not just abroad, but at home.
Man, Jesse, you used a phrase in there that just kind of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, which was civil war. Mm. Do you think we in the general population understand, as you've just lined out, that could be a very real consequence if we don't figure this out? Do you think we get that?
I don't. I do think that people fear it and are preparing for it, particularly on the right, where there's a lot of belief that the government is coming, that they're taking your guns, that there's now this widespread belief that their ideas are being censored. But I also feel that on the left, there is a little bit of lethargy and unwillingness to accept. So civil war can take on armed resistance, but in the same way that I responded and said that today conflict is not just about military, it's also about ideas. One would really fear a situation where the next, I don't ally with any political party. We believe that no problem has ever been solved at the same level of consciousness that creates it. We believe that the only way for us to get out of this is to shift the paradigm so that we're taking what we're learning about neuroscience, we're taking what we're learning about trauma, we're taking what we're learning about policy, we're taking what we're learning about public health approaches to mitigating violence. And we're actually not just addressing the extremist threat, but we're addressing the underlying root causes at the same time. We've lost the ability to think with complexity. And I think that when Donald Trump was elected out of office and the insurrection came, a lot of people thought that that was the beginning of the end, that you could simply silence people, that you could simply push them off and that they would go away. Nothing could be further from the truth. We just saw the election in Ohio for the primary for the Republican card, where a Trump supporter far outdid the polls in the same way that Donald Trump had done in the past. And we see a lot of momentum in the rhetoric and the narrative that suggests that in the minds of anybody who takes their news predominantly from Fox News in particular, they are under attack. And they're coming for their guns, they're coming for their people, they're coming for their race. And so I don't know if it's hard to imagine where it could possibly escalate to the point of civil conflict. Because the federal government has grown so large and the military has grown to a degree where it is powerful. But in the event that we get a transition of power back to the right, then it is true that the overwhelming proportion of local and state law enforcement officials do ally more so with the right wing, maybe not at the federal government level. And the federal government could certainly mitigate any conflict. But what we are looking at is potential collapse. We're looking at an economic crisis that transitions into what's already a social crisis, already a medical crisis, right? So we have all of these synergistic components of society, cultural, social, psychological, coming out of a pandemic where we don't even realize what the long-term consequences of that are, both at a health level, but at a psychological level, at a mental health level. The rise of mass shootings is somewhat shocking. And eventually, people will, if they're suffering under a decreasing quality of life, then the conditions of uncertainty set in. And people that are operating under conditions of uncertainty that have particular traumatizing backgrounds, which our system creates because of our lack of access to healthcare and other variables, they can easily escalate themselves to violence. So I do think that what we're seeing with regard to the way the protests communities shape out is much more likely. So you'll have deadlock in metropolitan areas where the militant far left is attacking the system and attacking the far right, which they've now conflated with every conservative. And the far right assumes that it's their duty to go out and do something. And you have something that looks like along the lines of Portland, where the real people that suffer are the taxpayers, where there's been $100 million worth of damage to downtown, where shop owners and business owners have had to board up and they're already suffering through an economic crisis. And what that does is it feeds the further economic collapse. And we already have so much debt. We already have Federal Reserve policy that is really pushing debt to a high level. And now, as of a few days ago, we're looking at potentially 7 million evictions. So those are the root causes that you actually have to address. The question is how to address them. And the way that you really address them, in our opinion, and that's why we deal with countering violent extremism and terrorism, is because if you can address the most aberrant behaviors on the outliers of society, then you can learn a lot more about what it is that causes people to get to a level that's almost unimaginable for most individuals to understand. And then you can start to think currently about how to mitigate the hyperpolarization escalation. And at the same time, to think one generation out in building that paradigm shift that I'm talking about, putting it into schools, disseminating it across the board in a cultural manner where consciousness can be elevated. People don't like to use terms like that because we've really reduced ourselves to this raw scientific perspective of life where we want to be able to measure everything. And so there's another component of that with is which is with regard to science and the role that science has always played in elevating. And right now, the most innovative countries in the world that are taking a scientific and technological progress to the next level is not the United States, even though our academic institutions typically are the best in the world and maintain that reputation. We have a lot of people catching up with us. And so if we just think about home, which is something that Americans are really predispositioned to do, and we don't think with complexity in the same manner we don't think with complexity about the hyperpolarization, feeding hate, feeding violent extremism, then we really won't realize that we need to sell a vision and we need to live by a vision that understands the importance of the order that we built in the aftermath of World War II. I, as a person who used to be an extremist and hated my country and came to realize that it was largely a result of my own trauma and my own frustration being projected onto society, but living in that state of fight, flight, freeze, living in a very black and white perspective, I've come to appreciate complexities, but I've also come to appreciate, no matter its imperfections, the American system and the fact that it has birthed the liberal order that we live under. I, coming from both sort of perspectives and experiencing both, think I've come to cherish something that most people are ready to discard, but don't have. When you ask people that want to do away with the American system, the oppression, the long history of white supremacy, and you ask them, well, what's your alternative vision for how society might run if we do address these core issues? Typically, it's only a grievance. There is no vision for a better future. And so that reminds me a lot of the jihadism that I myself once used to believe in.
You've used the phrase trauma. Your own story is riddled with trauma. Can you dive into how trauma led you down the path to extremism that you ultimately ended up on? And this is a two-part question, so we can go there. But what is it? Do you describe it as collective trauma that we're all experiencing right now in the U.S.?
Yeah. So in the world of trauma, you have PTSD, which is instigated by a negative event, a single occurrence typically. But then with other efforts, which interestingly enough, the American Psychological Association has not adopted a definition that has been empirically proven to distinguish between complex trauma and PTSD. Complex trauma is something that is evolutionary throughout a human's life course. And it's usually the result of adverse childhood experiences. We've seen that if a person has a high number of adverse childhood experiences, which could include child abuse, sexual abuse, being beat up as a child by a loved one, being persecuted and bullied, when you add those things up and you look at correlations, adverse childhood experiences are highly correlated to things like criminal behavior. They're correlated to things like sex offense. They're correlated to things like addiction. They're correlated to things like mental health complications. We don't have enough data on it, but in my field, we've been studying, and there has been other scholarly work on it, correlations between violent extremism and adverse childhood experience. So what your early developmental years and you experience, you begin to either learn how to control your emotional regulation and how to think things through with complexity. But people that are traumatized, they live in a black and a white worldview because they're living in constant states of uncertainty. And they always exist in a state of what they call hypervigilance, where their reaction will either be fight, flight, or freeze. It's not going to be given the ability to cope, to process, and to stay in a rational mindset as they process external information. And that's probably why extremist narratives and hyperpolarizing narratives resonate and resonated with me. It's very easy to see the world in a black and a white lens because it gives you calm. It gives you certainty, right? It makes you freeze, but you don't realize it. And what the ideology of extremism became for me was an addiction or an opiate outside of myself that prevented me from looking inward and dealing with and learning the coping skills and the emotional regulation skills and the concept of mindfulness and seeking out mental health treatment for some of the complications. There was a lot of resistance there because those ideologies reject that because everybody's traumatized. But when you take it to the level of collective trauma, I think that, again, not to get into the complexity of it all, but when you think about our society, it's not conducive to healing trauma or to imparting those skills that can heal from trauma. So it's very easy to teach people about how brains in states of uncertainty are operating. We should have that built into our curriculum, and we should have components of our school system teach people about mindfulness, about meditation, about the importance of not working all the time. In the United States, it seems like we live to work. And we live to work, and many of our people don't even have access to healthcare. And even if they do have access to healthcare, mental health coverage, behavioral health, substance abuse is not covered. And so what you have is you have a lot of people that are need treatment walking around without the ability to get treatment. And then when you add the flavor of 20 years of the war on terror, where we were constantly being told that we were under threat and under attack, and where as a consequence of fighting wars abroad, we neglected our development at home. And now you add to that also on top of that a COVID-induced extra level of uncertainty, isolation. We really are going in a direction where I would argue that we are all living in a state of PTSD, essentially, or complex trauma as a collective society. And that's a reason why simplistic narratives resonate. And there is a lot of momentum and a lot of awareness in our society about the importance and how trauma-informed approaches to life and culture and education and mental health treatment, and even the work that I do to counter violent extremism, how they are actually more effective than pharmacological approaches. But yet we have a society that is run by big pharma. We have a top-down order where we are supposed to believe that we live in a free economy. We're supposed to believe that there's not authoritarian hierarchical structures in our society. But when big pharma can rule out the inclusion of complex trauma because the evidence suggests that it can't be treated with medication and has to be treated with non-pharmacological medication, and when Wall Street essentially controls the economy and operates like a parasite, doesn't really care about the domestic situation, you have the fracturing of empire. And the fracturing of empire does not just come with economic or military decline and defeat. It also coincides with a cultural decline and a consciousness decline in the people. And it's not atypical for people to not recognize what's going on. In fact, because they start to, for the first time in their life, have to worry about the basic necessities. There's that period of rise. And then during that period of fall, people fear tomorrow. When we look at 32% of Americans, Rasmussen polling is a little bit off, but nobody does competent polling on a regular basis other than Pew. But every month, Rasmussen runs a poll where they ask, do you think America's going in the right direction? Only 32% of Americans even slightly approve that we're going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. That means, a large portion of our society are living in fear of tomorrow and are already buying into the idea that we are a nation in decline. These are, you could go on and on about the data that suggests that things are not in a very good state. But I do think, back to your original point on the fact that maybe people don't notice that we could be slipping into civil war. Well, that would be explainable very easily if we started to think in terms of the fact that we all might be traumatized. And so we all might be basically numbing ourselves with the allegiance and the tribalism that we've fallen into, which suggests that our tribe is fine. It's the other side that's the problem. So if we can just eradicate the ability of the other side to exist and write them out of existence, right, then things will be okay. And in fact, that will only exacerbate the problem.
I'm struck in hearing you say that by the fact that that phrase that you heard uttered, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, in knowing your story, that ultimately drove you into jihadist movement, extremist movement. I'm struck by the lack of the ability to equate that and draw the line to the either you're with us or you're against us, pushes the people away into the very thing that you want to avoid. Mm-hmm, exactly. Why is that so difficult for us to make that connection? Where's the breakdown?
It's inherent in the human condition. We are predisposed to be tribalistic. And with the rise of democracy and multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism, there's a component of ourselves that hasn't evolved to the way where we can accept that. And so where we've fallen into democratic lines and with the progresses that democracy built is when you are living under tribalism, you had allegiance that was built around your biology and your birth. Your allegiance was to the chief. Your allegiance was to the tribe. It was very small. It was a closed network. When you birth democracy and you blanket the world with nation states, your trust doesn't lie any longer in the chief. It lies in the institutions. And if the institutions are failing a large portion of people, then there is a predisposition inside of ourselves to go at the system, particularly in a two-party democracy, where you're approaching it from the same way tribalistic mentalities would have approached the situation. And so anywhere that you see an elevation, I'm a Muslim, of course, and we see the Prophet Muhammad came in Mecca to preach this message of one God and monotheism to a polytheistic society. He was ostracized, he was kicked out. But what he did, whether true prophet of God, imposter, whatnot, it's a fact of the matter that he built a system that was of a higher order because your tribe didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was your belief. He united the tribes in the Arabian Peninsula. And within 100 years after his death, that system went on to expand all the way into Spain, all the way into almost China, because it was a paradigm that was superior to the simplistic mindset of tribalism. I would argue that we have reverted to a neo-tribalism without realizing it. And that's why we say that what we're learning about science and trauma and neuroscience and the developments of psychology and sociology and all of the sciences, we start to need to pull from it. Because the only way that we'll be able to get out of that is to teach people directly and indirectly and through culture and the arts that we're predisposed to be like that. But if we're going to take the next step, if we're going to elevate above, we can't just elevate above the development of the reliance on institutions for our new tribe or our new tribalism. We have to rely on building institutions that are built on principles that are higher and of a higher order than those which we're now reverting to. And I think a lot of that is encapsulated in the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution. But I do fear that those principles that certainly were not perfect, have never been perfect, but allow, the concept of free expression creates the opportunity for dialogue and engagement as opposed to violence and conflict. The right to bear arms is really a check and balance against the government. But at the end of the day, it's been turned into a narrative that is promoting civil war, right? But at the end of the day, what we do have is we have principles in life that are above and beyond that. But I would argue that we're slipping back into what preceded the birth of the democratic system without an option and an alternative. I like to think that we could establish more decentralized institutions that are more democratic, but that also uphold the principle of a republic, which is differentiated from a direct democracy. But I fear that a lot of people believe in tearing down the system, not in rebuilding it in a manner that can take us to a level where we're not being neo-tribalistic. So it's quite natural to do so, but it's also more natural to do so when you're living in a state like collective PTSD, where minds that are operating in the amygdala, where fight, flight, freeze, and emotional response operates, not the prefrontal cortex where consciousness and rational thinking operates, they love a good black and a white tale, because then it's not your fault. It's the other guy's fault. And you're not guilty of what the other guy's guilty of. They're the evil people. You're good and you're righteous. When you really step back and you look at it from an objective standpoint, both narratives, both sides are largely built on the same principles. And they're not built on understanding the importance of maintaining dialogue, showing sympathy, showing empathy, showing compassion. But we do have all the tools and all of the science and all of the spiritual ethos to tap into in a narrative that can resurrect the system, resurrect this idea that there can be justice, but no real paradigm shift in revolution has ever come about when you really study history. The only real effective way to social and sustainable change has always been art, creativity, followed by, nonviolent activism, essentially. And other than that, even if you do tear down something, whatever has always come to replace it has been just as bad, if not worse.
How did your removal from extremism come about? Like I hear you saying all these things that you envision for the future, and you're talking about arts and creativity and dealing with our PTSD and our collective trauma. What did that look like for you? I can't imagine that it was one singular event that you were like, up, I'm out. What did that look like for you, man?
Change is a process. It's certainly not an event. And it's a tough one because it requires you, rather than to look outside and numb your pain, you have to sit with it. And first you have to learn how to sit with it. So my organization threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad in a cartoon. It caused international controversy, led to terrorism, led to Facebook getting shut down, led to threats. It was crazy. And I knew that the game was up. I fled to Morocco in 2010, in the summer of 2010, because I figured that I would be indicted if I stayed in the United States, and I would have been correct. But the indictment in the US stayed sealed for about a year. And while I was there, to survive, I started to teach Arab millennial youth to study, to go abroad to the United States and Britain, predominantly, hypocritically, quite in fact, because I would have rejected any Muslim being exposed to Western society, but I needed to live. And while I was tutoring the affluent millennial youth in Morocco, the Arab Spring broke out. And it was quite an exhilarating and inspiring time because it happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which made a lot of people in the world think that the system was crashing. And everybody was living in a state of uncertainty. And here was this glimmer of hope for people that had lived under mostly Arab dictatorship for generations, and now were demanding their freedom and demanding their democracy. And in my conversations with Arab millennial youth, I realized that certain things that I had taken for granted, that certainly would not exist under a Islamic state as I was advocating for, or a caliphate, were things that were preventing beautifully creative people that had so much to offer the world, from attaining a level of success and contributing to this world of globalization. And it was conversations that were fascinating with several of my students that first plant this seed inside of me as I watched, though I lived amongst the Arab world as it was rapidly transforming, and watched, union workers in Wisconsin replicate the process. I watched Spanish citizens go out on their streets against what was happening, and all of them were holding placards that were referencing the Arab Spring. And I was motivated by that, and it re-tapped into this idea. Nobody gets into extremism to become a terrorist. Everybody gets into extremism because they think that it offers a vision of truth, and they think that it answers that spiritual nourishment that is oftentimes missing, that meaning, that purpose, that significance that we all strive and crave inherently as well. And so I was exhilarated by this ideology, but then was in my ability to plant that first seed of doubt, was able to sort of take a step back and process. And all of a sudden, the propaganda that was being issued in the midst of the Arab Spring from the hardcore jihadist groups like the Islamic State, which was then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda core, the last message that bin Laden left was from Abbottabad and related to the Arab Spring. And the messages that they were releasing started to show that black and white simplicity. The other component was that I had stepped away from the network and associating with my jihadist friends because I had run. So ultimately, I still had to pay the price. I woke up one day and Osama bin Laden was killed on Al Jazeera. I saw the fact that Osama bin Laden had been killed. And 2 weeks later, I was picked up coming outside of a Casablanca mosque. And I thought it was too late. I spent 5 months in Moroccan prison. And it was there that I really started to reflect that I had thrown my entire life away and felt like I had so much to offer the world. I felt like I had really lived and become a self-fulfilling prophecy. My mother told me that I would never amount to anything, that I was stupid, that I thought I was better than I was. And, really psychological abuse was worse sometimes than the physical abuse. So I really was hardcore depressed. I met in there a imam who I used to translate his lectures. He was a hardcore jihadist and he used to walk me around in the yard each day. And he would ask me about my life, and he would ask me about my experiences as an American convert and why I converted. And he never asked me about the ideology, but one day he told me that if you look at the ideas that we adopt in the interpretations of Islam, they're exactly coincident to what we've been through. And he said, that's not believing in Islam, because what we say in Islam is bring the evidence and then believe. Don't believe and bring the evidence. We believe in because of our experiences, and then we find the evidence that supports the opinion. And that pretty much summed up the way that extremists interpret information. And that set me off on a path to learn how to be an objective critical thinker and to not allow my trauma and my psychological damage to interfere with the way I processed information. The United States came to pick me up in a private jet. And when they flew me home, I was quite different than they originally imagined. In the United States, we like to put people in solitary confinement. So I ended up going to solitary confinement 23 hours a day in a cell in Alexandria, Virginia, waiting for my trial. And this guard who was opposed to solitary confinement would take me to the law library 3 or 4 days a week for 10-hour shifts and let me sit up there where I could at least be exposed to books. And what I did was I dove into Encyclopedia Britannica's great books of the Western world. And I started to read, the philosophers from Descartes to Thomas Paine, right, who I consider a philosopher, Montesquieu, and a lot of different people, Gottfried Leibniz, and a lot of different philosophers. And then I would also read on the shelf, because I was in Alexandria, Virginia, they would have like biographies of the founding fathers. And they also had books by Daniel Kahneman on cognitive biases. They had books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, The Black Swan. And what that did was it painted an ability to think with complexity again. I was isolated and told I could only take information from certain scholars in Islam. And that the way that you learned was not to think for yourself. I had eradicated the ability to think for myself. And I had adopted a worldview where I needed a sheikh. I needed a scholar to teach me. And then I would go back for those other 3 days in the cell. And the only thing I had in the cell was the Quran and the literal scripture of Islam. But the new ideas, the ideas that I was reconnecting with, would, of course, now start to influence the way I interpreted the religion. And I had to maintain that balance between bring the evidence and then believe, or believe and bring the evidence. And even in solitary confinement, I started to find myself particularly in certain moments, at peace. Even in a cell like that, 23 hours a day for many days of the week, I started to find that there's something inside of yourself that no matter where you put yourself, you can find contentment and you can find happiness. And you hear people talk about this, gurus, you hear, meditators, you hear religious leaders and spiritual leaders talk about it, but I experienced it. And it's almost like tasting a drug where you want to dive deeper and deeper and get to know yourself even more. And ever since then, I've been trying to do that. And one of the lessons that I've taken away is that the amount of work that we do on the inside of ourselves manifests itself on the outside. And I know that sounds quite metaphysical and is for many people probably considered to be largely a fallacy, misperception. But for me, it's been very true. And I like to think that if we can get them to a point where we can do that collectively, it might also provide a solution. And that's why when you read that statement, it's not so much about who they are, but it's about who we are. If the tribalistic identities that we were surrounding ourselves with were more reflective on their own faults and more reflective on being able to come to this comprehension of the importance of complexity and creativity. And so, after that, life has been much more artistic. The creativity that when I was a kid, I used to draw, always very intelligent. And one of my true strengths in life was being able to write and to tell stories and to think creatively about certain things. And now I basically design programs and think outside of the box in this realm of trying to solve these problems. And it's got a degree of creativity that gives me the same drive that I had as an extremist, but it's also coincident to learning how to cope with the emotional regulation, learning how to sit still in a moment when I'm stimulated by external stressors, and to develop this skill set. And every time I take a step and elevate, something happens where I get more stability, where I get more ability to impact and reach individuals. I work with people that behind closed doors that nobody will ever know about, extremists that are really having a hard time, and being able to share some of my own experiences and build them into the programs that we implement now and watch them work for other people is quite invigorating. And it gives me hope that we can get to a point where we can get above and beyond this mess. So I keep keep holding on to that string and that thread of belief that, we all have a part to play in fixing things and elevating to the next shift. And I can see a world and visualize a world now where we tap more into creativity, consciousness, and art. And I really think that that's what separates us from most of the rest of, species. Most of the rest of the earth is this ability to shape things, this ability to build things, this ability to tap into consciousness and utilize that. And yet at the same time, when you look at like the predominant amount of external information, it seems like it's messaging to a Pavlovian dog or a Skinnerian lab rat. It's really geared towards reducing us. Our operations on Facebook are totally dedicated to studying how we behave so they can sell us stuff. Why not build a society that's dedicated to tapping in and motivating us to create and to express ourselves with consciousness and to be human beings and to cultivate character? I fear that we've lost that. But finding that inside of myself, and for anybody else that has experienced something similar, which so many of us have, is truly the purpose of I will say our creation, because I do believe we were created.
And Jesse, you've mentioned critical thinking, you've mentioned trauma-informed education, you've mentioned art and creativity several times. If I can, and you've also kind of dove a little bit into, just kind of skimmed the surface of your own childhood trauma and the abuse that you suffered at the hands of your mother. What did a young Jesse need to stop from going into the extreme places that you went, where extremism presented the black and white clear picture that seemingly put your mind at ease? What did a young Jesse need?
Jesse needed a hug, and he needed held, and he needed recognized. And every single extremist that I've ever met, when they get to a point where they're ready to tell you about how they felt when they were youth, would have needed the same things. And so when I think back to youth, I remember going to elementary school, having to wipe the spit out of my sister's hair, take her to the bathroom, wash her face off because she got beat on the way to school because she sat in the front seat beside my mother in the car. And I remember, having to like hold myself together. And I'd like to think that if we were living under a period where we had trauma-informed education and where teachers were trauma-informed, someone would have noticed. When I was in high school and got to high school and I started to act as a bad kid, started to become the class clown and the black sheep and smoke marijuana and sell drugs and started my path towards ultimately running away at 16 years old, all of the signs were there. But instead of being called in and asked, what's going on, right? If somebody's acting out, it's usually as a result of something going on in the house, in school. And I remember being, labeled as like a bad kid, and they tried to send me away to like juvenile detention center and punish me. And nobody ever asked me. And when I did muster up the courage to tell family members, and when I mustered up the courage, I even told law enforcement, I told guidance counselor at school, but nothing ever really happened. To remove me from that situation, my father knew, and the predominant opinion was just be tough, just deal with it. That's what boys do. So long story short, I mean, especially in youth, it's really important that we start to recognize the people that are the most cast out and ostracized, and we start to, honor them. There's school shooters every year that if just a couple kids in the classroom showed them a little bit of care and compassion, they certainly wouldn't go on to become shooters. We have to start to look for the people that aren't being reached. And unfortunately, like I said, our culture doesn't breed that. It doesn't breed compassion. It doesn't breed empathy. It breeds narcissism, competition. We almost are at a point where we take, especially with our youth and the millennial situation and the Gen Zers that are coming up, they haven't tasted of the affluence that preceded their generations. And they come from parents who are much more successful. And as they enter the workforce, there's a frustration that induces happiness when someone else fails. And that's evident. And our high schools are very much full of xenophobia and bullying. And we want to be part of the cool crowd and will insult and intimidate others. we need to build trauma conscious societies. And what that means is when we look at trauma, trauma is not just about an individual, and we live in an individualistic society. The way that a person processes trauma, if a person that processes trauma has good social connections, right, good community connections, they don't go on to develop symptoms of PTSD. They can heal them and rectify them. When they live in isolation and they operate alone, then their propensity towards commission of violence, commission of crime, commission of addiction and other variables is much higher. So we are, by our very nature, social creatures. But our society, for those that are the most downtrodden, the most disadvantaged, it doesn't really birth that kind of compassion and consciousness that I'm talking about and learning about, later in life. And it's probably why I dedicate so much of my time to trying to figure out that aspect, because I had, at the same time that I became an extremist, I was shipped off to schools with a high IQ to study in, private institutions. I was a very good athlete, very talented athlete, until I started to smoke marijuana in high school. I was a very outgoing person, very kind, but at the same time, very hardworking and dedicated. I mean, I was a committed extremist with full-time job, going to college and everything. So everything I ever did in life, I put my whole heart and soul into. I just never had the skills to do it in a pro-social way. I was antisocial because society didn't reach me. And I think if even one person would have sat me down and gave me a hug and spent a little bit of quality time with me, they could have served as a role model. I might not have become perfect, but I certainly wouldn't have became what I became. And we'll never, that's the interesting part about life is it's not linear. It's one conversation, one time, one hug, one kiss, one piece of recognizing somebody as a human being that can totally affect the rest of their life. And I like to think that even an interaction with the convenience store clerk is an opportunity to maybe plant a seed that can do that for someone. And that totally changes, not just the way that other people may experience their life, because it's actually also builds into yourself this humbleness and this feeling of, safety and peace. And you don't see a lot of that anymore. With the birth of the cell phone and the iPhone and the smartphone, no matter how much we progress technologically, we grow more and more distant from actual human contact. And people need human contact. They need love. They need told that they're valued. They need told that they're good. They need told that if they're going through something, somebody cares. And all too many people, and especially children, don't get that.
In the light of what you just said, Jesse, and going back to what you said very early on, where you mentioned understanding the fault in your own beliefs and recognizing the truth in others, and I'm paraphrasing there, added to the fact that you had to teach yourself to become a critical thinker and were inspired by so many of these books that you were reading while in prison. How do we get there? What steps can we take to become a more critical thinker where it's not so threatening to look at another viewpoint and say, there may be some truth in that? How do we get there?
Well, it's going to be a challenge, but as Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
I love that quote.
So each one teach one, each one do, and try to have conversations like this that might inspire 2 more, 3 more, and create momentum. And human beings are incredibly resilient, right? In times of catastrophe, it doesn't take an entire collective to come to these awarenesses to make it mainstream. It takes our artists, it takes our intellectuals, it takes those that are driven, those that have undergone transformative change to do it for us. Doesn't take the strong man, because the strong man only leads to authoritarianism. It takes love and compassion that mobilizes into a movement. And it doesn't take everybody. Just like smiles are contagious, we know that. Happiness is contagious. If you smile at someone, it's much more likely that they will smile. So friend of a friend phenomenon sets in. And all kinds of positive things like compassion and empathy are contagious. If you do charity for another person, it's much more likely that they'll do charity for another. And so that's what we need to think about. We need to think in terms of the micro, and then also think in terms of the meso. We can't deal with the macro yet because the macro is really complicated right now. But at the end of the day, we have competing visions, and we need to respect other people's visions. And the only way that we'll be able to really do that is if we can agree on underlying principles, right? And like stagnant principles that we all agree on, and then have opportunities to re-engage around them. And then teach people about critical thinking in the process. You know, we have entire states. Hyperpolarization has grown so large that entire states feel a certain way almost. People are leaving certain states, moving to other states because of their political perspectives. They're not allowing their daughters and their sons to marry people from the other political side. It is a tribalism that is based upon not knowing the other, because you believe almost like if you touch it, you'll be infected by it, that it's a disease. It's like Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda at this point, with very different messages, very different visions. But one thing that a willingness to engage, like we get criticized a lot for talking with like neo-Nazis, right? Because it's like, you know, you are being empathetic with the enemy, right? But every time you talk to them and you get them away from what they do in public, you start to see their humanity. And that's why there's an importance of, if we're going to reverse these processes, we have to all work to create opportunities to talk with the other side. And like I said, the more and more successful we can get, but the collective consciousness of our society is really predisposed right now to what you would call a negativity bias. There's just so much fascination with the negative, right? And there's an inability to promote an idea of, you can sell. Think of the archetype of bin Laden, you know, is very powerful. The archetype of Donald Trump, the strong man, or of some of the Bolsonaro in Brazil, you know, the authority is motivating. But so too, when you think about people like, you know, Gandhi, people like Martin Luther King, people like the Dalai Lama, you know, these are just as powerful. There's something about, you know, being in their presence, hearing their stories, reading what they used to believe in, that takes you into the same spiritual plane of motivation. And in today's day and age, our media and our arts are so influential on inducing what we're interested in. And so I like to think that, you know, we thought that the internet was going to democratize our access to information and put us in contact with people that believe differently than ourselves. In fact, it just creates echo chambers. But we know how to get out of it. I'll give you just one example before I end the response. Facebook studied its platform and its algorithm to see what its recommendations were doing. And they found that 64% of people that radicalized to violent extremism on the platform did so as a result of stuff that Facebook was recommending that they read, friend to friends, right? And then they developed tweaks in the algorithm to try to fix it. And their contention was, knowing neuroscience, knowing science, that if they put people in contact with the other side, that it would resolve some of those complications. And in fact, it did. But something else happened. They spent less time on the platform. And so Facebook removed all the alterations that they had made to the algorithm because it would have cost them their bottom line, and they're a corporation. And as we know, corporations run solely for profit, right? Just as we're told to do as individuals, they're not permitted to do anything that would affect the bottom line, particularly when their shareholders have a say in where they go in the future. But what we know about corporate social responsibility is that sometimes doing the right thing can actually lead to an enhanced bottom line, but it takes a lot of courage. You know, there's people that have given their low income wage earners raises of $30,000 and their companies are still completely successful and flourishing. These are the lessons that we need to share, but they don't make it into our consciousness. People don't know about them as much as they should. So I really just think that, you know, building society that is conducive to consciousness necessitates creativity. And I think we have a lot of artists, we have a lot of creators out there that are believing on this, but you're not going to get viral followings if you're talking about these things in the midst of a hyperpolarized context. But if you do the right thing, you know, you might be able to sustain the operation long enough to have an impact. And I think that that's what it's all about. Is we need more idealisms. We need more people realizing that, like, life is about so much more than attaining things outside of ourselves or competing with, the other person down the street. There's a certain level, anybody that's ever tasted of getting struck by that creative muse, right? Or of being in a situation where you can feel another person on the planet. I mean, it shouldn't even be rare, but it is. Those rare times when you can feel that this person really loves me and really cares about me and sees me for who I am and wants to know who I really am. Those things don't happen that much. But it can be induced if we can get to a level where the information that we're absorbing is teaching us these things. And that's what good art does, right? Good art has become subliminal. It has become almost nihilistic, right? Because it's for entertainment value only. And it's an inundation with massive amounts of information. But if you were to go to an outlet like Netflix and try to find, 10 films, 20 films that really struck your soul, you'd be there for like 2 days. You might be able to do it, but you'd have to navigate through mounds and mounds and mounds of dirt. And if you looked at the 6 o'clock news at a local level and you tried to find positive stories, you'd find that, 35-second, 45-second clips of positivity towards the end, maybe here and there in every episode. And if you look at what's going on in the mainstream media, you'll be hard pressed to find, positivity. When you're surrounded by negativity, you are the company that you keep. And so when the information that we absorb is all negative, that's really the problem. So we need to further decentralize society and realize that the internet itself cannot democratize our contact with alternative perspectives, but that we ourselves can use the tools that we have today that connect us all within 6 degrees. And actually, like on outlets like Facebook, we're all connected by like 4.5 degrees of separation. So we never know what will impact another. And the more and more people that we can get to take the courageous step to say, I'm not participating, even though if I choose a side, I'll have more friends, right? My life is not going to be invigorated if it is built upon a dehumanizing perspective of the other. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah. I know I went off.
Man, no, and that was super motivating for me and what I'm trying to do with this show. So thank you for that. Jesse, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
So I get labeled a lot. I'm always a former extremist, right? So I'd love to be asked the question, now that you're no longer a former extremist, who are you? Something along those lines, because it boxes you in the same manner that if people treat you as a former extremist, but it comes across sometimes as if they'll always hold you as an extremist, it can, in a sense, be stigmatizing, and it can hinder your ability to believe that you can grow above and beyond that. Yeah.
What would you call yourself?
Just Jesse Morton. It would be Jesse wonderful Morton. To not be former extremist, because I hated Jesse Morton for so long because of all of the pain and the anguish. And so when I converted to Islam, I was in jail, and the Moroccan veteran of the Soviet-Afghan jihad that actually radicalized me took me to a white sheet in the cell block, and he said, I'm going to give you a new name. And he gave me this name, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. And Yunus Abdullah Muhammad was the embodiment ultimately of every piece of trauma that I had. And I love the idea that I had killed off Jesse Morton, right? I hated the name. I hated to hear it. I still have a hard time calling myself that because of some of the anxiety that it provokes. But when they came to pick me up in Morocco in the airport, in the private jet to fly me home with the FBI, Navy SEALs, Secret Service, and all of the ABC agencies, the work that I had done on myself in Morocco, they dressed me up like I was going to Guantanamo. They plugged my ears, they covered my eyes, and they marched me up the steps, and they sat me down in the jet. They pulled the blinders off. They put my Quran that they had confiscated from my property in front of me, asked me if I wanted to read it on the way home, pulled the earplugs out, and they read me my Miranda rights. And they said, well, your legal name is Jesse Morton, but you are technically choose to go by Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. What do you want us to call you? And knee-jerk reaction, I said Jesse Morton. And so my whole process from that moment has been reclaiming an acceptance of who I am and being okay with who I am. Because a lot of people, it's self-hatred that drive whatever it is that they experience that's negative in life. And so I just would love to be Jesse Morton, valued for the creativity I bring to the table. I mean, it's a major asset to have gone through things in life, right? But the ultimate idea is to elevate above your mistakes and to be empathetically forgiven. I don't want sympathy. I was horrible, but I like to imagine that at some point I can make amends to the point where people will be able to see above and beyond, because my kids are going to grow old enough and they're someday going to have to come into contact with the fact that daddy used to be a bad guy. And your brain thinks, what if they are embarrassed by me, right? What if they are fearful to take their father, with them, or to tell their friends who their dad is, And so just little stuff like that pops into your head. And the industry that I work in is largely suffering from the same hyperpolarization we're talking about here today. And so the fact that I talk to extremists and allegedly platform them for having dialogue with them, and the idea that I'll never be able to heal long enough to have a lot of things to say about how we should do interventions and things, it still takes a burden on me. So I guess ultimately at the end of the day, I'd love to reclaim my identity as just Jesse Morton.
Well, Jesse Morton, thank you so much for doing this, man. I was enthralled with everything you were saying. How can people understand the work that you do today? Where can they go to follow you, to get up to speed on what you're working on?
So they could visit a website, lightuponlight.online. That is where we run our domestic operations, or they can go to pnetworks.org, which is our base organization, and hit the contact us button. And I'd love to hear from those that hear this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Jesse, thank you so much for doing this. This was an absolute pleasure.
Great. Wonderful. Take care. Keep in touch.
That moment there at the end of the conversation with Jesse was one of the most poignant, heartfelt moments that I've had on this show so far. The obvious acknowledgement of his past, but that he wants to be known for doing good now and all the things that he has become since then. Just a fantastic look at the man who is Jesse Morton. I so appreciate Jesse coming on the show and sharing his story and his perspective. Do me and Jesse a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might also need or want to hear Jesse's story and the wisdom that he shared this week. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Jesse that I have on each and every week here on the show, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And also, if you listen to this show on the regular, please go and leave a rating and review to let others know what you think of the show as well. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always reach out to me through email. It's michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.